Now we're ready to assemble our 5th gear synchronizer and hub. On the counter shaft there is what they call a drive ball, a small round steel ball that's recessed into the counter shaft. And that needs to be there to engage this cut on the 5th gear hub. So on the counter shaft we've got a hub that the 5th gear rides on, and there that drive ball just aligned. 5th gear on the output shaft. Just splines on there as normal. And then 5th gear on the counter shaft rides on this split needle bearing. So a little dab of grease there, adhere that needle bearing in place, make it a little easier to assemble on the drive hub. Now we install our 5th gear speed gear and our 5th gear blocking ring. And again, we mentioned the biggest difference between 5th gear and any of the other gears is such a large gear on the counter shaft driving such a small gear on the output shaft. That's how we get our effective overdrive ratio out of the transmission. And now we'll install our 5th and reverse shift lever into the case. Oh, pop the O-ring out. We'll reseat this O-ring. And then retainer plate and the nut and the retainer plate bolt. We'll just snug these down for now. We'll come back for final torque on these later. And now we're going to assemble our 5R synchronizer, fork, and rail assembly. All this has to go into the transmission case at once. If you recall, when we took this apart, this was a little jammed up. This piece had been misassembled. So I've taken the end of this shaft and the end of this bolt to the sander and polisher and removed some burrs on there. If this was going back into service, it might be recommended to replace those components, but they'll certainly assemble just fine. In our fork, we have this drilled hole where we drop in this spring, and that spring is going to be followed up with this ball. This ball will act against those grooves cut into the rail, and that's what provides our detents for neutral, for 5th, or for reverse. So in order to assemble that, get a little dab of grease on the ball here, drop it down in. There we go, drop it down into place. And then get a hold of it with this Allen wrench so I can depress it against the spring as I install the shift rail. Press it down. There we go. And should find the detents. There we go. It just locked into place. So find which side is neutral. Right there in the middle. We've got neutral. And now that'll be ready to assemble with our synchronizer and install into the case. And then the whole assembly is retained with this bolt that comes through the side of the case. And now we're going to assemble this 5th and reverse synchronizer with its fork and shift rail. A little bit difficult because we have to align this rail into its hole in the case. We have to align the shifter lever tab onto the shift fork. At the same time, we're splining the hub onto the counter shaft and making sure that the detent for the blocker ring key lines up on the blocker ring. So a lot of things to align here at one time. And in, that's started, that's dropping back into place. Get that shift rail where it belongs. Alright, and I believe we have that installed. Key's wanting to jump out at me for some reason. There we go. There we go, just a little clocking. And that's our 5th and reverse synchronizer. Those are held in place with this set of split washers. The split washers that retain the 5R synchronizer are selective. They're available in several different thicknesses to control the end play of that 5R synchronizer. Shop manual calls for 0 to 19 10,000ths in play. I have a 15 10,000ths feeler gauge here. Obviously, if it had less than 0, I wouldn't have been able to assemble it. But I cannot slide in my 15 10,000ths feeler gauge. So virtually they want 0 in play, 19 10,000ths, less than 2,000ths of an inch. We have less than 15 10,000ths, so our in play is good, and those split washers are retained by this thrust washer retaining ring assembly. And now we're going to finish up the assembly of reverse gear. We'll start with our reverse gear blocker ring, our reverse speed gear. The reverse speed gear sets on 2 cage needle bearings and a bearing, a washer, and the nut. Now this nut should be replaced every time for this training unit. I don't have a new nut, so we'll reuse that one for now. Then we come up to our output shaft. We install this spacer, our reverse gear onto the output shaft. Oh, actually I messed up. I have to leave that bearing off while I install this reverse gear onto the output shaft. There we go. And then our reverse idler gear. There we go, reverse idler gear into place. Now we can install that bearing, that washer, and that nut. One thing about transmissions, they're not very forgiving about order of operation. Everything has to be installed in just the correct order. Last item that we've got installed is this rear bearing. The shop manual does have a special tool listed which would grab a hold of this and force its way down. We could use a dead blow hammer and try to drive that into place. Since I don't have the appropriate special service tool, and I'd prefer not to beat that on if I can avoid it, what I'm going to do is take this bearing, put it in the oven for a few minutes, about 425 degrees, and then that should be able to drop right into place and reinstall this nut. Now this nut should be new every time. For this training unit, I do not have a nut. I'll just reuse the old nut. It'll be fine for the training operations. Alright, we've had this bearing in the oven at 425 degrees for a few minutes. Hopefully it'll snap right into place, and it did. So now we'll install our nut. Both of these nuts will need to be torqued and staked into place. And now we've reinstalled the bearing nuts on both the counter shaft and the output shaft. The counter shaft nut torques to 119 foot-pounds. The output shaft torques to 181 foot-pounds. And then to make sure those don't back off, the shop manual calls to stake those bolts. You see that slot that's cut into the shaft and this collar that's made onto the nut, and we come in here with a hammer and a punch and we stake that down. Because I'm reusing an old nut, I'm not going to stake this one on this training unit. It'll just get that nut worn out if we do that over and over again. But that's the staking of the nut that we use in order to retain that in place. I've decided not to disassemble the shifter assembly. A couple of reasons. Number one, the only reason typically you'd be disassembling the shifter assembly is if one or more of the shift forks required replacement. The pads on these shift forks are in excellent shape, so they don't show any need for replacement. The other reason I've decided not to take it apart is I don't have a really good set of roll pin punches here at the home shop, and I don't have access to any replacement roll pins. So if I damage any of these roll pins during disassembly, then I'm not going to have much luck getting them back together. So the main trick of getting the shifter back on is just make sure that both the shifter and the transmission are in neutral. You've got to get each of these shift forks over its synchronizer, and you've got to get the 5R lever into that pocket right there. As long as all of that lines up at the same time, the shifter typically drops right into place. There we go. We'll bolt that down and verify operation. And we have our shifter assembly bolted down. Last thing is just to verify first, second, third, fourth, fifth, and reverse. So that is all functional. I believe we've got a successfully overhauled M5OD manual 5-speed over